Please.
Thank you. Okay, let me say welcome and good morning to our First Amendment workshop. This workshop is called Cancel Culture. You can't say that. And we have two experts with us who will teach us and talk about this, I think, more recent concept of cancel culture and what it means when it comes to the First Amendment. My name is Julie Rosa, and I am the First Amendment specialist at Iowa State University. This session is part of our First Amendment Days, which has been happening all week. This is our 19th year of hosting a week-long celebration of the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment. And my students know I always have to stop and take a moment and say what those 5 are. So they are speech, press, petition, assembly, and religion. And so we will talk about the intersection of the First Amendment with cancel culture today. Actually, our session is not limited to Iowa State University. I see this workshop as really a statewide effort to educate Iowans and really anyone across the nation about some of the current issues that are happening when it comes to the First Amendment. So in the interest of time, because we will have to wrap up right at 9:50, I'm going to keep the introduction short. I think Andrea is too. Many of us know the brilliance in our midst here. But I encourage you to follow up with emails or a website checking and follow our experts. So to start us off here, we have Dr. Andrea Frantz. She is a professional of digital media at Buena Vista University. And she is, as I mentioned, truly a treasure for the state of Iowa when it comes to her expertise in the First Amendment and really across the nation and the world. So, and I'm proud to call Andrea a friend. So Andrea, take it away.
Thank you so much, Julie. I really appreciate that. That was very kind. No one has called me a treasure, at least for, I don't know, a week. So that's pretty cool. I am very excited to introduce all of you on this panel to my friend and someone I really, really admire, Frank LaMonte. And I'm going to read a little bit of his background. And this is really for the benefit of those who've never had a chance to actually meet him. I think it's important that you understand who he is and why he's such an important voice. Frank is the director of the Brechner Center for Freedom of Information at the University of Florida. And prior to his current role, he was executive director of the Student Press Law Center, which is really kind of how I got to know Frank in Washington, D.C. from 2008 to 2017. During his tenure, he launched a number of major programming initiatives, things that have been extraordinarily influential, including the New Voices initiative that has resulted in the enactment of legal protections for student journalists in 13 states, I think, maybe more, I'm not sure.
We're up to 14 now. Washington State joined recently.
Right. So, yeah. That's why I had that caveat. I thought, oh, maybe I didn't get all of them.
And came really close to number 15, came within 3 votes in Nebraska this year.
I knew that. Nebraska was all over the news here in Iowa. So yeah. And also he launched the Active Voice, which is a fellowship program for all of my students on this session. Fellowship program for undergraduate college students, specifically young women, I believe, who are interested in being huge voices and promoting First Amendment education. Before joining the SPLC, he practiced law in Atlanta and clerked for federal judges on the North District of Georgia and the 11th Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. And this is so interesting, it should come as no surprise that Frank was also an investigative journalist and a political columnist. So this is part of why he does what he does, and he does what he does so well. He was Capitol correspondent for the Florida Times and the Florida Times Union in Jacksonville, and Washington correspondent for Morris News Service and the Atlanta bureau chief for Morris. On a personal note, I just want to say I credit Frank for being really one of the biggest influences in my life for encouraging my passion for First Amendment law. I have worked with Frank and seen what Frank can do to inspire people to be passionate about this. And he certainly hit me hard when I first met him. and I'm going to offer a shameless plug here. The other two people who are in that sort of elite group of influencers in my life are Ken Paulson and Jean Polisinski, both of whom are going to follow this session in the next two sessions. So sort of the great triad is joining us this morning, and I hope you all get as much out of this as possible, because these are incredible people. So Frank, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us this morning and taking time out of your Friday.
No, thank you for the opportunity. And what a great lineup you have put together. That just speaks to how well respected Andrea Frantz is in this space, that when she calls, you pick up the phone and you jump. So.
Jesus, thank you. I have students on this, but no, we're going to credit Brian and Julie and others for this as well, because we've all been putting our heads together on this. So I think we should talk a little bit about cancel culture. What do you think? I'm struggling a little bit, Frank, with this whole notion of cancel culture. I hear people like Josh Hawley and other politicians who complain of being canceled because so much of their positions and the way that they talk about certain things encourages a little bit of blowback from another perspective. And on the other hand, I read, say, a columnist like Charles Blow at the New York Times, who says there's no such thing as cancel culture. There's free speech. And he likens ultimately this to economic and social pushback as organized dissent. So what do you think? Is cancel culture a thing? And if so, how do we even talk about it? What is it? And what are
No, you're not alone in finding this concept to be fraught and confusing, and there is no agreed upon societal definition of what is within the bounds of cancel culture. And it's certainly not a legal term. It's certainly not a term that any court or any judge has ever defined. And I think it's a hugely unhelpful, not to be that student in the class who quarrels with the premise of the teacher's question, but I am going to quarrel with the premise of the teacher's question that cancel culture is one of those terms that has become so unhelpful because it is a loaded and weaponized term, and we end up arguing about the term more than we end up arguing about the underlying behavior. It's a little bit like the phrase social justice warrior. When social justice warrior first became a thing, it was a badge of honor that people wore. Who wouldn't want to be a social justice warrior? And then talk radio sort of hijacked it and turned it into a pejorative. And then we started having arguments about who wasn't a social justice warrior and whether that's a good or a bad thing. And we completely lost the thread of the underlying merits of the conversation. And I'm afraid that's where we are with cancel culture too. So I'm not interested in engaging with Charles Blow at all about whether it exists or not. I think we should have a conversation about the underlying behavior, which is really 6 or 8 different types of behaviors that are all underneath this broad umbrella, some of which are things to worry about. And frankly, some of which, as you've described, are not things to worry about, are just the marketplace at work or the political process at work.
All right, let's talk about those things maybe to worry about.
Yeah, well, go ahead, go for it.
Well, I was just going to say, I think there's a difference between the public figures who say, how dare you cancel me, and the not public figures, the people who ultimately lose jobs, lose social status, lose friends and family for sort of one-off comments or even, yes, attitudes that are put out there socially. I think kind of all of this boils down to very strong reactions to unpopular speech. So can we talk a little bit about some of the problems associated with that?
Yeah. So as the lawyer, I should lay the groundwork by saying, right, that the First Amendment protects you only against acts by government agencies and government employees. So if you are Colin Kaepernick and you can't get a job with the San Francisco 49ers because of your speech, that's a bad thing, but it's not a constitutional violation. The First Amendment case law has always recognized what's called the theory of the marketplace, right? And that the best reaction to disagreeable speech is counter speech. And so in many ways, what has been termed within the broad umbrella of cancel culture is often exactly what the First Amendment tells people to do, which is to talk back, to speak back, not to seek to impose the will of the government on the speaker, but to impose the will of the marketplace. So you cited at the top of the discussion the Josh Hawley situation, where Hawley loses a book contract with a private publishing house and decries that decision as cancel culture. Well, we can debate about whether that's a good or a bad decision by the book publishing company, and maybe it was and maybe it wasn't, but was it a First Amendment problem? Surely not. The book publishing company, as a private business, has the ability to do business with anybody that they choose to. Just like if you wear a disagreeable t-shirt into a Target department store, they can ask you to leave. You don't have a right to speak inside of Target's premises. And so in fact, interestingly enough, the First Amendment equities are on the other side of that conversation. The First Amendment protects the right of the publishing house, because we know that corporations are people and corporations have First Amendment rights. It protects the right of the publishing house or the San Francisco 49ers to decide that they don't want to be associated with certain speakers. So in First Amendment land, a lot of these questions are actually very easy. There is no First Amendment recourse against a private party. And the First Amendment does stay the hand of government to be able to impose consequences within some limits that we can talk about on speakers. So the First Amendment issue is actually like pretty clear cut and pretty easy. But so much of the debate over cancel culture is not about government sanctions. It's about the marketplace. It's about what the counter argument to cancel culture is consequence culture, right? That is the counter argument is, well, no, you are just facing the consequences of the marketplace. And we have all decided collectively that your speech is so disagreeable and so reflective of a malignant heart that you no longer deserve to have employment or a platform or a television show or whatever it is that we'd like to see taken away from you. And I think when you are a public figure, when you are a person who has interjected themselves out there in the marketplace, especially somebody who has tried to influence public opinion or garner a following, then part of doing that is you bring upon yourself a certain degree of scrutiny of your character and your behavior. So I worry much less about the celebrities who find themselves on the receiving end of a social media bombardment. And I worry much more about just Joe average college student, for instance, the person that makes a misstep on social media and reaps this whirlwind of condemnation as a result. And those are the people for whom I think we can properly have a conversation about cancel culture. I would sort of define cancel culture to the extent that it exists as a very small subset of what's really being called cancel culture, to include sort of disproportionate overreaction by total strangers to an isolated instance of speech. If it includes those factors, it's disproportionate, it's an isolated instance of speech, and the people who are reacting are people who are not in the proximity of the speaker, they're just total strangers who are doing a kind of a social media drive-by, then we really might talk about cancel culture. You know, if you are someone who is a coworker of the person who is the speaker, and you have to coexist in a small confined space with that person for a long period of time, then I care about your opinion, right? If you're uncomfortable being around somebody because of the sentiments that they have expressed, that's important, and we can't disregard that. But if you're just a person doing a drive-by on social media because you don't like a tweet, and this immediate escalates into, well, that person shouldn't ever be able to go to school or hold a job in America again, that's when we have to, I think, be concerned about, are we going too far with our going from 0 to 60 in 1.5 seconds in our reaction to speech?
Well, and there have been some cases recently that have been examples of exactly what you're talking about, right? So recently there was a story about a janitor at a school who lost his job because he used the N-word as he responded to a student, challenging the student, don't use that when you're talking about yourself, right? So it was, taken very much out of context, but ultimately the very fact that he used the word got him fired initially. And there was all of this pushback We've got another case of a cheerleader who, because she didn't make the varsity squad, threw out a rather incendiary Snapchat, I believe.
Mhm.
And again, all kinds of pushback, all kinds of response to this. So what is it in our culture that we need to be sort of wrestling with in terms of pulling back those overreactions, for want of a
Mhm.
better term?
Yeah.
Yeah, go
Yeah.
for it.
So, all right, three comments about that. Comment number one, thank you for raising that Mahanoy School District case, which is in front of the US Supreme Court right now, and which I hope everybody will pay close attention to and follow. Because as a college student, this is an all the marbles case for you, especially if you're at a public institution, not so much at a private institution, because just like Target Department Store, First Amendment rights don't protect you against punitive action by a private educational institution. But if you're at a public educational institution, you have a degree of First Amendment protection against benefits or privileges of education being taken away from you using governmental authority to punish you for the content of speech. And this Mahanoy Schools case, which will be argued at the end of the month and decided by the end of June by the US Supreme Court, is that case that we've all been waiting for a decade for the Supreme Court to tell us what is the extent of the punitive authority that a school, or I think likely a college as well, will be able to exercise over speech when a student is not in school, not at a school function, not using school equipment or property to express a sentiment that the school finds disagreeable on personal time. And as you mentioned, this is a cheerleader, doesn't make the varsity squad. She's frustrated, she's angry, and with one of her friends at a convenience store on a Saturday afternoon, posts a Snapchat with a couple of F-bombs about just venting her frustration. School doesn't target any individuals, doesn't name any individuals, doesn't say the name of the school, doesn't claim to be a representative of the school in any way, but is disciplined by the school because one person of the 250 people who saw the Snapchat complained to a school authority that she had said something unfavorable about the cheerleading team. And I think that is, that is emblematic of the concern that we have to have, whether we call that cancel culture or whether we call that I would never, ever, ever tell that person who is the offended listener that they don't have every right to complain, because that too is protected by the First Amendment. And we should encourage the counter speech by all means. If the speech is bothersome to you, speak back against it. I'll ardently defend your First Amendment right to do that. So where I lay the responsibility for those type of decisions is not on the people demanding the cancellation, but the people fulfilling the cancellation, right? We should expect more of the people in government authority than to respond to the one thinnest skinned, shrillest voice in the crowd who says, I demand that you punish the cheerleader, right? We should expect professional educators to say, this is a teachable moment. This is an educatable moment, and we don't go straight to disciplinary action or straight to punishment for sort of minor, no harm acts of offensive speech. And so that was a lost educational moment, a lost opportunity to turn a negative into a positive because the school overreacted. And I think too often when we have the debate about cancel culture, we're faulting the people who post the counter tweets on social media. We're faulting the counter speakers when we should be placing the blame on the authority figures who just need to have a stiffer spine, who need to be able to say, you know what, we had a 6-hour-long tweet storm. It's going to pass over because people are going to start tweeting about other things 6 hours from now. And we need people in authority to stiffen up their resolve. So yeah, sorry, we got off on a little bit of a tangent about that, but it's an important tangent because that case is really, the Supreme Court only takes a case involving student speakers once about every 15 or 20 years. So when they take a case, it's a big deal, and it will set the standard for potentially 50 years to come.
A lot of analysts have suggested that the precedent established by Tinker versus Des Moines Independent School District is really at stake here with the Mahanoy case. Do you think that's true?
I mean, I certainly don't think, because even the school district has not argued for the repeal or the weakening of the Tinker Standard. What they've argued is that because all speech is now portable thanks to smartphones, and it is all equally capable of reaching the school and having a disruptive impact on school, that it should all be considered in-school speech, and it should all be equally punishable regardless of when and where it happens. And that is a perhaps understandable instinct by authority figures who are terrified of the power and the reach of social media. And I think there is every risk that when this case gets in front of a bunch of judges who are unfamiliar with and probably a little phobic about social media, that they will be tempted to make that kind of a panicky decision that because of the viral nature of social media and the possibility, however slight it is, that a student's post might be seen by a limitless audience, we are going to give schools a free hand to punish and to discipline it. The problem is that when you diminish First Amendment protection for off-campus speech, you are diminishing it for all off-campus speech. There is only one First Amendment, and the First Amendment applies equally to all media. And so when you say that a Snapchat vent, like Brandy Levy's Snapchat vent in this case, is unprotected by the First Amendment, then you are also saying that a student's speech into the open mic at the school board is unprotected, that a student's letter to the editor of the newspaper, an interview with the local TV news I-team, all of that becomes unprotected speech. A petition drive to try to have an abusive coach removed from their position, that becomes punishable by the school if the school can forecast that somehow this is going to cause a disruptive impact on the school. And the school, in its brief to the Supreme Court, has defined down this concept of disruption to mean interfering with the harmony of the locker room. And so anything at all that might cause other people inside of the locker room to be distracted from their game preparations would be enough to make speech unprotected by the First Amendment and punishable. And that's an awful lot of authority. That is an awful lot of authority. And when you think about the kinds of things that teenagers might have disagreements about, that might encompass a vast amount of speech about political and social issues, which the Supreme Court has always told us occupies this very high protected space at the top of the First Amendment pyramid. And so my very favorite quote in all of First Amendment law, if you read a Supreme Court brief and you see this quote in it, there's an excellent chance that I wrote the brief because it's my good luck charm. I put it in every brief that I write. It's the NAACP versus Button case that Justice Brennan wrote, that because the First Amendment needs breathing space to survive, government can regulate only with narrow specificity, is what Justice Brennan writes. And what he's telling us is that all the benefit of the doubt always has to go to the speaker. And particularly when you're dealing with a 14-year-old speaker like Brandy Levy, we need to give that person plenty of elbow room to make honest mistakes. And did she make a mistake with this Snapchat? Maybe. Maybe it was not the best judgment in the world, but thankfully, not the best judgment in the world is not where government punitive authority kicks in. We get to make bad judgments. We get to make poor choices. Poor choices do not remove speech from the protection of the First Amendment.
Yeah, I think we have a question in the chat, so I want to go to that. Nikki?
Oh, this is a great question. So yeah, I use the phrase teachable moment, and somebody asked a great question. So in the Brandy Levy case, the F-bomb Snapchat case, who is it a teachable moment for? You know, I believe that you should always use the tool for the job that uses the least amount of force, right? If I'm trying to open a jar, I don't go out in the garage and get my sledgehammer, right? You use the tool that is the least amount of force that you can use to do the job. And I think in a case like the Brandy Levy Snapchat, if there was a member of the team that felt like Brandy Levy was somehow a bad influence on the team and having a bad effect on that team, a single member of the team, and if the coach had some hurt feelings, that's not punitive action to me. That's a telephone call, right? That's a telephone conversation. Brandy, you hurt my feelings. I work really hard at being a coach and you hurt my feelings. And you're making it harder for me to do my job. You're stirring up the other kids. I really think, Brandy, that I think you should apologize. I think you should apologize to these other kids who tried out and who feel really strongly that you've now denigrated their accomplishment of making the cheerleading squad. I'd like you to apologize. that's the tool that opens the jar. And I think that's a perfectly adequate and proportionate response to that speech that doesn't result in having to unleash school disciplinary authority, doesn't give Brandy Levy a record that she has to carry with her, that so that when she applies for a job or when she applies for a college, she has to say, yes, I was disciplined for disrupting the school. You know, why? Why do we want to put that on her record when an educational conversation would do the job so much better?
I agree wholeheartedly. I think we have another question.
Oh, you know, and actually someone followed up. This is a great point, right? That when a student vents like that, right? When a student vents like that, rather than seeing the student as an adversary, especially a 14-year-old, right? Maybe the right response should be, Brandy, are you okay? Brandy, is there something we can do to help? Because you're obviously unhappy about school, and maybe you're unhappy about more than just this momentary decision about the cheerleading squad. Maybe there's something about, you know, after all, a school, and as a person who works in public education, I try to remind myself of this all the time, we are a provider of government services. And when people who are dissatisfied with the quality of the government service let us know that, that is customer feedback. You know, that is feedback that people ought to be encouraged to give. I want my students to complain. You know, I want my students to tell me when they're dissatisfied. And did she pick the exact perfect choice of words to do it? No. But again, the First Amendment doesn't require us to use perfect words. You know, there's ample First Amendment case law in the off-campus world that, you know, flipping your middle finger to a police officer out of frustration with the behavior of the police is an act of First Amendment protected speech. It's not the nicest decision in the world. It's not great judgment, but is it an act that's punishable by government authority? It is certainly not.
I'm excited actually that we've got people chiming in.
A lot going on.
I feel like we could totally sort of ignore some of my questions here. Hunter asks, so would you say holding people in positions of power accountable for ignorant or harmful things that they've said, you know, shouldn't be considered cancel culture? That's an interesting question, I think, with respect to when we talk about the cheerleader, when we talk about the janitor in the school, those are not people necessarily with power at all. In fact, the antithesis of that probably.
Right.
But there is a question about people who do hold authority in some fashion or another, not necessarily government, but people who hold authority who say things that are reprehensible socially, right? What do we do in those circumstances? I mean, again, I don't know that this changes anything. Positions of power, if it's not government.
Right. No, so I think there are. This is a great question because it opens up. You know, I do think we need to peel back the onion a little bit and define some subcategories of what is broadly being referred to as cancel culture as not being cancel culture at all. And the two things that I would exclude categorically are A, something where members of the public are simply calling for an elected official to pay some kind of consequences, reputational consequences for an act of distasteful speech, especially an act of distasteful speech that somehow is indicative of an underlying flaw that goes beyond a single act of speech, right? I mean, I think that's one of the really important things that we can't lose sight of is that why do we punish, right? Why do we punish speech? Generally, the reason that we punish speech, the primary reason that we punish speech is because speech may be indicative of an underlying propensity to do harm, right? In other words, when a person says something that is indicative of white supremacy, we're not really punishing the tweet or the Facebook post. We're punishing the fact that this person is likely to act on their propensity to be a white supremacist, right? So this is why when a police officer goes on Facebook and uses a racial slur on Facebook, we fire the police officer from the police force, and we should. I would categorically exclude that from cancel culture, and so would the First Amendment exclude that from cancel. The First Amendment would say, when you are a government employee, you're entrusted with a position of responsibility. you act or speak in such a way that you undermine the public's ability to trust that you'll use that position in a responsible and fair way, out you go. No more First Amendment for you. And so that police officer or that school teacher that engages in an act of racist or sexist or anti-Semitic speech on social media, they've got nothing. They've got nothing in the land of the First Amendment, and they've got nothing, I think, in the land of cancel culture. That really is consequence culture to me. That is, you have shaken the public's ability to trust that you will responsibly use the authority of your government position, and you have now stepped outside of what the First Amendment protects. Again, the people that, and you phrased it so perfectly, Andrea, the people that I care about are not the people. Josh Hawley doesn't have a boss. Josh Hawley doesn't answer to everybody. No one's asking Josh Hawley's boss to fire him, right? What they're saying is, you know, you're a bad person and you shouldn't be reelected. Really, is what a lot of the kind of counter speech amounts to. But Brandy Levy is in a very different power position. Brandy Levy has no power in that transaction. And so when people seek cancellation, right, they're asking people in authority, and in her case, in governmental authority, to actually use their authority over a less powerful person to take something away from them. And yeah, I think that's where we need to at least be concerned about the risk of overreaction.
I see a question here from Craig Harris. And I want to try to paraphrase this a little bit. How would you explain the suspension of speakers that posted a hidden interview of CNN anchors that went out of the way to try to turn the public against the former president?
I think what happened here is this is the guys who do the sting operations. And I'm not calling the name of the person right off, but right, there are these James O'Keefe, right? The guys who do these sting operations where they try to get, and CNN is in their crosshairs right now, to get media figures to say things that betray their liberalism, and then they broadcast that in order to undermine the credibility of those journalists or that media organization. And if I'm remembering the headline from yesterday right, and the barrage of headlines has been pretty fast in the last 24 hours, but I guess either O'Keefe or his organization or somebody associated with them got their Twitter account discontinued. The person who asked the question can correct me if I'm remembering that wrong, but got their Twitter account discontinued shortly after having posted a string of these hidden camera sting videos where I gather they set somebody, I haven't watched the underlying thing, I gather that they set somebody up who worked for CNN by using a dating site, and they had somebody pose as a potential date for him and engage him in conversation in which they kind of baited him to say, you know, yeah, it was our agenda at CNN to get rid of Trump, basically. And he says this in the context of his quote unquote date. And then that was disseminated, and then shortly afterward, the Twitter account was permanently discontinued. And, you know, so in First Amendment land, again, no First Amendment issue here at all, and people have sued over this and have unanimously been unsuccessful in doing so, and trying to claim that somehow Twitter has some First Amendment duty as a quasi-public square to allow any speaker to use the platform for any speech that they want to. And that's a non-starter in First Amendment land. You know, I think this is still being debated as to why Twitter made that decision. They are not copying to that this was a cause and effect based on the one CNN sting, but they are claiming that it was some pattern of abuse of the account, including using some impersonation accounts where the operator was using aliases to operate other accounts. So I don't know enough about the underlying decision, but I do think, I mean, what this points to is people really do feel invested, understandably so, in those social media platforms and in the persona and the presence that they have built on it. And there are entire, especially for those of you who are Instagram users now, right? There are entire businesses that are built on the availability of a social media platform that isn't yours, you know? And it's a little bit like building a store on a piece of real estate that you don't own. You know, one day somebody may come along and pull the piece of real estate out from under you, and there goes your store. I think people really do feel a deep investment in the social media presence and following that they have built up, and they feel really robbed when it is taken away from them. And for that reason, many smart people, there's a really good column from a few years ago that I recommend by Nabia Syed and Ben Smith, who at the time were at BuzzFeed and have now moved on. But Nabia and Ben were really the first that I saw to come out with this idea of a First Amendment-like set of transparent standards for that platforms should voluntarily adopt, where they should transparently agree that they will make their decisions about who gets to use it and who doesn't and why, and that they will consistently apply them. And Facebook, as you may know, has made a gesture toward this. They now have an adjudicative board where you can actually go to sort of the Facebook Court of Appeals if one of your posts is pulled down, and you can argue for why that post didn't deserve to be pulled down, and this neutral group of experts will vote on it. Your post could go back up again if you win. And so there's been some movements in the industry toward that. But one of the things that first round of Facebook Court of Appeals cases showed us is that even people who are very expert at making these decisions, people who sit there and moderate content for a living as their profession, get it wrong a lot of the time. They miss irony, they miss nuance, they miss context. And this is another reason why I think it is so important not to overreact to social media speech, because so often people are speaking ironically, they're speaking out of context, they're speaking in a way that depends on you being kind of in on the joke. And if you're not in on the joke, then you may go to overreaction. There's an especially tragic case of this that took place down in Texas. It actually got a little bit of coverage in the mainstream news a few years ago, but a student who was 18 years old, he was a high school senior. He was playing a multiplayer video game. And this is before Twitch, before you had the ability to engage in like kind of in-game conversation with your fellow players. And so what people did before Twitch was he opened up a Facebook chat with his fellow players. And so they are playing the multiplayer shooter game, and they're also chatting about their strategy on Facebook. And somehow this chat about the multiplayer shooter game is seen by somebody who doesn't realize it's about a game. The suspicion is that like one of the players' parents screenshotted it, shared it with some people in their network, and somehow third hand it gets all the way up to somebody in Canada who calls the police in Texas and says, this guy is planning to shoot up a school and you need to arrest him right away. They show up at the house, they arrest this guy for chatting about a shooter video game, and he spends 4 months in jail before he can make bail, and has this felony threat speech charge hanging over him for years until he plea bargains it away because he chatted about a video game. So this is why we have to really, really be careful about jumping to immediate kind of free speech death penalty for people who say disagreeable things on social media.
Wow, I had never heard that story, but my goodness, that's crazy. I want to see if we could kind of shift things just a little bit. I know you're in Florida, and the vast majority of us are up here in Iowa. So I'm going to ask you to kind of respond a little bit to some stuff that's going on here in Iowa.
Yeah.
That's pretty relevant to us. Currently, we're sort of I think we reflect in many ways what's happening in the nation with our own legislature, which is predominantly Republican, majority Republican at the moment, really decrying this whole concept of silencing of conservative voices. And this is getting at unpopular speech, right? But it's also an issue of a perception of silencing that happens. And this perception issue is the biggest issue, I think, with our default to discussion of cancel culture. Because again, as you've very deftly illustrated, the First Amendment is not really in jeopardy here. And in fact, it's actually being exercised. But this whole concept of the claim of the silencing of conservative voices, especially on campus of late, has led to discussions here in the state of Iowa and proposals that have died, but still have the potential to come back, right? Proposals for things like ending tenure, because tenure allows, I don't know, those liberal faculty members to sit in their seats forever, right? It doesn't allow for more conservative voices to get in, I guess, is the argument there. There's also been discussion here in the state of Iowa, and there was pending legislation again that died, about prohibiting the use of the 1619 project in classrooms. So the state legislature is really sort of being very reactive to messages that, generally speaking, they're not comfortable with. I wonder if we could talk just a little bit about the perception of what the First Amendment is and what we're doing in terms of educating a population that clearly doesn't know or understand what the First Amendment is on these issues. Because when you've got someone in power in the legislature who claims that the First Amendment is actually being threatened because of these things, when in fact that's not the case, this is what people hear. So I'm just wondering if you could kind of react a little bit to some of these measures and our own understanding of the First Amendment as it applies.
Yeah, no, it's a great, and one never knows in politics whether people are legislating based on a genuine misunderstanding of the First Amendment or whether that's part of their messaging. And I usually try to assume good intentions on people's part and to assume that they're just misinformed and they're not really acting out of a malevolent intent, but they're just misinformed. But honestly, First Amendment 101 is the easiest thing in the world. When in doubt, assume that the First Amendment is on the side of more speech and not less. And you can't go wrong. I mean, that's the very first, it's like the first rule of Fight Club, right? And first rule of First Amendment Club is always assume that the First Amendment is on the side of more speech and not less. And when you start with that premise, then it sounds almost kind of Orwellian to say, teacher, we are going to forbid you from using this curricular tool of your choice so as to preserve the First Amendment. Right? We're going to limit your speech in the name of preserving the First Amendment. Sounds a little bit Orwellian, right? And it is. There is a notion, and it's a very ill-defined notion, and it is especially ill-defined at the K through 12 level, a little better defined at the higher ed level, of what's called academic freedom. And academic freedom has always been understood to give a special degree of extra elbow room to educators to make their own decision. When you're in that classroom, you're the captain of the ship. You get to decide what to teach and how to teach it. And the government can't look over your shoulder and say, I don't like that lesson plan. And so for that reason, I think it's perilous and it's fraught to get elected officials, especially people at the state level who are distanced from the classroom, to get into the business of deciding that particular curricular materials are or are not suitable, often, honestly, based not on the fact that they've read the materials or that they've reviewed the materials, but that they've sort of seen the shorthand critique of the materials and they don't like what they stand for. If you read the 1619 Project, or if you listen to the really beautifully done podcast about it, it's honestly, it's the opposite of being a sort of an anti-American thing. It's really a very affirming thing about America. It points us toward, a better future. And I think if people actually familiarize themselves with the material, a lot of the demonization and mystification of it would go away. But I don't fault, legislators are busy people. They don't have time to read this whole thing. And that's why they shouldn't be in the business of dictating it, because they really should leave that to the curriculum specialists. But you addressed a broader point too, this idea of, down here in Florida, academics are feeling a little bit in the crosshairs these days because there is a bill advancing through the legislature that would require an annual ideological survey to determine whether faculty do or do not lean profoundly toward the left. There's been no second act to that yet to determine, all right, well, so suppose the survey comes back in and it says 75 or 80% of the faculty are liberal. What would that mean? But the suspicion is that there would be some sort of effort to try to then use that data to pursue a compelled ideological balance among people on faculty, which again, if we learn nothing in the law of the First Amendment, one of the areas where the Supreme Court has spoken just loudly and clearly for over half a century is that you can't have ideological purity tests to be a faculty member at an educational institution. Some of the very most robust First Amendment case law that there is are cases like the Keishian versus Board of Regents case out of the Supreme Court, where they said you can't tell somebody that in order to have a professorship at the university that they've got to swear a loyalty oath to America and renounce any past affiliation with the Communist Party, because we just don't ideologically screen people in order to have government jobs. And so, yeah, that's a really well-established principle that I think is being strained because of the polarized political climate we find ourselves in. The last thing I would say about that, I do think that there is always going to be a tendency, as there must be, for educational institutions to tilt to the side of kind of default to greater inclusiveness, right? Because that's actually part of what educational institutions are directed to be doing. Under Title IX, under federal anti-discrimination law, educational institutions have an affirmative duty to make sure that nobody feels unwelcome because of their race, their gender, their religion, their ethnicity, right? And so for that reason, educational institutions are always going to default to sort of trying to create a more comfortable climate for people who might feel marginalized. And that translates to many people as liberalism. I don't have a dog in that fight. That's not my argument. That's not my thing. I'm a First Amendment lawyer. But I think that's where that's where the conversation is leaving the tracks. Is this an act of liberalism to say, please don't engage in racial hate speech during the Zoom call because it'll make other people uncomfortable to sit in the class? If that's liberalism, okay, call that liberalism, but I think that's actually a duty of the educational system to tell people to behave civilly toward each other.
Absolutely. And yeah, that's an interesting fine line. And I'm thinking a little bit about your scenario of sort of that ideological survey in Florida. How's that any different from requiring people to report what their religion is? Wow, that's an interesting challenge.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say that, because people who don't get the First Amendment always get it when you talk about religion. And that's often, to me, as an educator, that's where I like to go in these conversations, because people do have an innate compass that tells them that government regulation of religious beliefs, or as you're describing, even government inquiry into your religious beliefs, just deeply offends something inside of their moral compass. They get it right away. I helped somebody write a brief going back to the Levy-Mahanoy schools case on behalf of college athletes around the country. The brief is called the Brief of College Athlete Advocates. It's one of about a dozen that are on file with the Supreme Court if you're interested in reading these things. And one of the hypothetical scenarios that we posed in there was, well, if you give a high school coach the power to punish speech because they think that that speech is going to stir up disagreement and distract from focus in the locker room, then what would you do to the coach who says, I am requiring everybody to sign this waiver that says you must come to Sunday worship service with me as a member of this team for the good of team cohesion, because I have found that it'll promote better team unity and it'll eliminate disagreements in the locker room if we all have the same faith and we all worship the same God. And so let's all get together for a Sunday prayer service, and it'll be mandatory for your participation in this team. Right? As soon as you say that, 100 out of 100 people get it right away, that of course you can't make people waive their First Amendment rights in exchange for participating in your team. And of course you couldn't ever enforce a waiver like that. So people get it right away when it is about religion. And I think if you have that kind of a gag reaction, that instinctive gag reaction to government intervention in your religious beliefs, you should have the same instinctive gag reaction to government intervention in your political or ideological beliefs as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Frank, I want to thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation. I feel like we could keep going for hours.
Oh, I love talking with you about this
Yes,
stuff.
we got
Hope
more
to come back sometime soon.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks everybody for coming. And hope to see some of you at the next couple of sessions.
Thank you
have a
again for the
fantastic
opportunity.
day. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. See you at the next session.
Bye.